Welcome. A warm welcome on a wonderful West Seattle night. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Clay Eals. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. And I'm thrilled to have all of you here for what is truly, no exaggeration, a unique event, a once-in-a-lifetime event. We are here to honor a West Seattle legend with a program that focuses on West Seattle in one of the most beautiful homes in West Seattle.
Second most beautiful home.
It's going to be a tough crowd.
And what tonight is essentially, given the timing of this weekend, is this is a giant Valentine for heritage. This is something that all of you in the room share a passion for in one way or another. We are here to support heritage and to support the storytelling that goes along with that. And everybody here is going to take the stories from tonight and carry them on to other people who were not here. And fortunately, we also are going to be able to have this program live on forever on videotape, so that people outside this room can experience what you are, not quite as intimately, but certainly with the same content, and we will go far and wide with this. We're very grateful for this. I have some people to introduce, some board members. We have our board president, Marcy Johnson, right here. We have another board member, Carrie Korsgaard, over here. We have a couple of former board members. We have Flora Bell Key, one of the colorful people in the room. Where are you, Flora Bell? And we also have Joey Richardson among us. And they always say, when you have an event, you need to introduce the electeds. And that sounds so pro forma, but we have somebody in the room who, he may be former to some of us, but not to me and many of us. He's Seattle Mayor for life. Greg Nichols over here in the corner, and his wife Sharon. The first and only mayor of Seattle from West Seattle. How about that? I think Ed Murray can kind of slip in and say that he grew up in West Seattle. You know, there's a little bit of a tie there too. And Greg is considering being a member of our advisory council, which we are very pleased that he is considering that. And we have another person in the room who also is on our advisory council, and he needs no introduction. All I need to do is say Jack Miller and his wife Heidi. I want you to give it up a little bit for some of the volunteers who are here tonight. Without them, this event would not happen. We have our caterer, Diane Venti, and helping her, Carrie Korsgaard. We have a volunteer videographer, Mark Yaroslaw. We have a volunteer photographer. Boy, be in the room with Art Wolfe as a photographer, Clem Daniels. And we have the people who greeted you so warmly at the door. We have Sandy Donnan and Sandy Hirano, and you'll hear from her in a minute, the inimitable Nancy McPhee. And you know, they say timing is everything. We have in the room, as about 20 seconds ago, Seattle City Council member Tom Rasmussen, who also is on our advisory council. Tom has been a major supporter of our organization, and if you follow the news at all, you know that some of us are crying tears because he's not running for a fourth term, but he has done such wonderful service for our organization and for heritage, and we thank you for that, Tom, in so many ways, out front and behind the scenes. And then we have all of you, every single one of you. You are here to support heritage. You are here contributing your finances, your time, your energy and your passion for heritage. And you're here because we have a very simple and yet very profound mission, which is to promote local heritage 3 ways: through education, through preservation, and through advocacy. And the support that you have expressed here tonight with your contributions coming in the door is going to continue to support such things as our museum operations, such as our many community programs throughout the West Seattle Peninsula, and certainly our part of our mission, preservation and advocacy. Just some quick examples of things that we're doing. We are embarking with the collaboration of some other organizations on a historical survey of the West Seattle Junction. Anybody notice any changes in the junction lately?
I don't recognize it anymore.
There is still some good stuff left. And we also are on the verge of having a very positive announcement on the Alki homestead. We have been on the case with that for more than 6 years since the fire, and we are so eager to get to the point where we all want to be on that. And this is all because of your support. It doesn't happen without your support. We had the biggest event in our entire history in terms of number of people. Just this past June, how many of you were at our totem unveiling? June 6th, we had 1,300 people in the street to witness the unveiling of the Admiral Totem Pole at our museum. Totem poles are near and dear to our heart, and Art himself has done a lot of photography up in Alaska of the style of totem poles that we see here in Seattle that are not indigenous to Seattle, but we embrace them as our own. And Art's photos of the totem poles are among many, many that document his dedication to preservation and advocacy. And as I make that comment, really, we have to save the biggest Valentine here tonight for Art himself. For him to take time out of his incredibly busy schedule. Art Wolfe Incorporated, he has, I don't know how he does it. He is... It's an honor for us to have him here. And what he is doing with his work is right in line with, it embraces, it supports our mission of education, preservation, and advocacy. He's very well named, of course. His work is fine art, but it is art in the pursuit of something greater, and the forms, the things of composition and texture and the things that make great fine art really are transferable into the composition and texture of our world. You know, Art captures the treasures of the world, and he has an unsurpassed love of those treasures anywhere in the world, and unsurpassed love of this community. And that's why we're here tonight, and that's what makes this an unusually apt event to be held right here, and an event you'll never see again. Now, I first got to know Art about 30 years ago when I was editor of the West Seattle Herald. And even then, he was really internationally known. And we did a story on him in 1985. Just read you a quick quote from the story. I satisfy my travel needs by traveling the world, but I'm like a homing pigeon. Every 2 or 3 weeks, I want to come back home to West Seattle. Now, some of you may remember, the reason I'm bringing up the newspaper, by the way, is I decided to wear a newspaper tie tonight. You might have noticed that every Peanuts character here is reading a newspaper. Got to keep those newspapers alive, even in this day of digital. That's how I got to know Art, was through the newspaper, and you may know, many of you, how many of you have a copy of West Side Story at home? Our newspaper created West Side Story right at the birth of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. And one of the 20 chapters in this book is on famous people. Guess who is featured in the famous people chapter? Art Wolfe. And he contributed not only some comments for the book, but also for a photograph of madronas in Lincoln Park that has become famous all over. Now that's 1987 when the book came out. Was anybody in this room at the book opening party at the old People's Bank at West Seattle Junction? Who remembers People's Bank? Right now it's a big high-rise and there's kind of no face on it yet. But that, we figured we wanted to be as close to the heart of West Seattle as possible. And on July 1st, 1987, we not only debuted the book, but we had 4 luminaries in the room to speak to us. We had Jim Whitaker. These are all from West Seattle. We had Emmett Watson. We had Normie Beers, and we had Art Wolfe. We were so grateful. Talk about a once-in-a-lifetime gathering. Wonderful event. Now, I've taken you back to 1987. I'm going to take you back even further because I'm going to introduce to you Nancy McPhee, one of our stalwart volunteer greeters at the museum. And she has a story about art that nobody else has. And I want you to hear her story, and she will then give you Art Wolfe tonight. Thank you very much. Would you welcome Nancy McPhee?
Hi. It's kind of scary being up here. I have a little story to tell. When in 1967, my husband was a volunteer at the Fauntleroy Y, and they were going to put together a trip to Bowen Lakes, a canoe trip to Bowen Lakes. And among them was my little son, who was in junior high school, and he only got to go along because his dad was going. And a little guy named Art Wolfe, and he was just a little guy. He was the young...
It was Arthur Wolfe back then.
Were you really? Oh, my goodness. Anyway, they carted the canoes into the lakes, and they canoed, and one morning, it was one of those kind of misty things on a mountain lake. And my husband woke up, and he looked out, and he said, "Arthur, what are you doing out there?" He says, "There's a moose." And John says, "Yeah, there's a moose. He's wild." And Arthur says, "I got to get the picture." He had his father's camera. His father was a professional photographer here in West Seattle. And he had loaned him a camera, and he was going to get that picture. And John says, "Come back, Art." "No, I got to get the picture." And there was this great big moose out there bottom feeding, as mooses do. And he kept getting closer. And John says, "It's a wild animal. Get back here, Art. Now I got to get the picture." And finally, John heard the click of the camera. Those were in the days of clicks and cameras. And Art turned around, came back in, and they finished the trip up. But as my understanding, talking to Art today, that was his first wildlife picture. And he doesn't have a copy of it. Can you imagine that?
He wasn't in the click.
That's true. Anyway, I would like to introduce to you Art Wolfe.
Thank you very much. I just returned yesterday from Antarctica. So I got in midday yesterday. I'm a little jet lagged. I've never given this slideshow. Those are all my excuses. So if you don't like it, just put up with it. Don't walk out in front of me. Right before when Clay approached me to do this, he hoped that I had all sorts of historical photos of West Seattle. Well, I do, but they're all of me. They're all pictures of me. So, and in fact, I didn't even know I had some of these pictures until I started going up into the attic and looking through old albums. And I was looking at photos that were taken a long, long time ago. And so I photographed them with my modern digital camera and made them into these slides. So many of these photos have never been seen before, but they're all of me. So that's really special. There was 2 things wrong with this photo that I saw. Was an Easter basket was not my style. So somebody put that stupid ass Easter basket in my lap, and I'm sure I wasn't happy about that. And it would have been rare that I would have sat there quietly with my brother and sister because we were always fighting. So wrong picture, wrong time. Later, I can remember being down at the Elks Club in Seattle and standing at the Christmas banquet. Is there still an Elks Club, actually? Is it still around? Okay. So I hadn't seen this photo until I took a picture of it. There I am in junior high. He's so cute. I went to Fauntleroy grade school. I was born in the West Seattle Hospital in the Junction. Went to Fauntleroy grade school. I grew up on 44th and 98th. I delivered papers to my next door neighbors, 2 older brothers that were always out hiking, and it was the Whitakers. They were my next door neighbors. And so in the last 25 years, I really got to know Jim Whitaker and his wife. We traveled to Antarctica together, but I would tell them I knew all about their yards. They had all these skulls and antlers around their garden. This painting was painted in when I was a junior in junior high, around probably 13 years old. And I had 2 teachers that had immigrated to Seattle from the Midwest, and along with them, they brought these little black and white photos of the farmhouses they grew up. And they gave them to me, and I painted these pictures and framed them and matted them and sold them back to the teachers at $30 a piece. So that was incredibly important for me to realize when I was 13 that I could actually make money from the work I was doing. I came up through a fairly modest income family, as most families in the 50s were. And so earning a little bit of money from drawing and painting was really a nice thing to have. I graduated from South High School. I hadn't seen this photo until a couple weeks ago. Remember Robert and I went up to the Dungeness and caught salmon, and we posed in my front yard up on 44th. Yeah, I was quite the athlete. Bird lover. Remember Farrell's ice cream parlor? This is when South Center opened, and I didn't work for Farrell's, but I had, there was a school teacher at South who was a drama teacher, which I never took drama, but he invited me to participate with about 8 or 9 other kids to promote Farrell's. He was being paid. He said, I'll give you all the ice cream you can eat if you put on that stupid hat and vest, and I did, and there's a photo. This is very close to where I lived. We had no view of Puget Sound, but half a block walk from where I grew up, there was this amazing view. And I think this photo probably was instrumental as to influence me as to what I do as an adult. Because I always looked westward towards the mountains, and there was the allure to go farther. And I always knew, I memorized the skyline of the Brothers and Mount Constance and Eleanor, and all those mountains represented at the time I was growing up a place that I wanted to go, the unknown to me. And when I got my first car, which was a 53 Chevy, it didn't take me long before I was out now beyond the wooded ravines of West Seattle into the Cascades and the Olympics. So the car represented a way to get to the forest. Vacations for our family was not to Disneyland, but it was to Nason Creek up on Stevens Pass or near Leavenworth to go fishing during the summer months. So I loved fishing. I hadn't really taken pictures at that time, but I loved getting out into the forest. When I was 7, I had a little bird book, mammal book, tree book. I knew virtually every fern, every tree, every bird, every mammal in the forest of Forest Court and Lincoln Park. So I was a naturalist at 7 years old without even knowing the word naturalist. So that was a huge thing for me, being out in nature. And back then when you were 7, you only asked when was dinner. And they would say, and they'd say, okay, bye. And then you would be gone all day long. And it was usually in the forest, playing in the forest behind Fauntleroy Church. In fact, when we were juniors and in junior high, I had a gang of kids called the Art Wolfe gang. I was reminded tonight of that because who was that mentioned that to me tonight? Somebody. Anyway, okay, they're gone. They knew not to stick around. We terrorized the neighborhood because we protected the forest. Other kids would come down and build fires in the forest or chop trees down, and we usually attacked them with bows and arrows. That was the Art Wolfe gang. And later, it was going to be developed, and the developer, John Fenton, died before his dreams were realized, and the family donated it to the city as part of a greenbelt. So that was the forest up behind Fauntleroy Church. For me, I was traveling now further and further afield, up into the Rockies. And when I would exhaust that area, I eventually got up to Alaska. I had friends that worked for Boeing, and we would go out along the coast during the winter months and have fondues. Remember fondues? It was a rage in the 70s, right? So this is out along some of those old shelters along the Washington coast. But that was my love. It wasn't cars. It was forest, wilderness, trekking. I feel like I was born with cedar scent in my veins. Everything that represents the Northwest, everything that represents Seattle is so true to who I am. There's no question that I would live here the rest of my life. I live 1.5 miles from where I was born and 1 mile from where I grew up. So my roots are strong and unwavering. And I travel the world. So yeah, these are pictures that are pretty boring to you. But as I got a little older, I started getting up beyond the wooded ravines of the Cascades and the Olympics, up into the slopes, skiing and hiking, climbing. Now it became more and more beyond the visuals. So these are just rare photos that occasionally would be snapped of me as I'm growing up. A high school friend of mine that went to South, his father worked for Boeing, and we parlayed that connection to Boeing into being allowed into the Boeing Alpine Society. We were too young to really work for Boeing, but they let us in, and I became program chairman. So I started booking at 18. I was calling up Jim Whittaker and Jim Wickwire and other famous climbers to come to my club and give presentations. So I watched and I learned how they gave presentations. I got into this kick of climbing mountains and thinking I was renaming them. I would make a flag during the week, climb a mountain the weekend, place it on the summit or nearby the summit as if I was renaming. So delusions of grandeur was really rampant in those years.
Still is.
Thank you. I think I probably should end now. No. So in 1969, Apollo Peak. I really got serious when I took a climbing class and learned how to, belay and descend in crevasses and climb mountains. And suddenly now I'm climbing bigger peaks. And this is now during my late teens and early 20s. I've enrolled at the University of Washington. Here we're climbing Mount St. Helens before it would become world famous. And we camped right on the glacier up in here. Part of that glacier, as you know, just exploded outward on that very side of the mountain. And from the summit of Mount St. Helens, looking down on Spirit Lake, look at my climbing outfit. Wooden ice axe. Oh, there's not a wooden ice axe. I had wooden ice axes. There you go. And long socks, and I would shop for wool pants at the Goodwill. The Goodwill always had great old wool clothing. So prior to going to the University of Washington, I would stretch watercolor paper, and there's a painting of mine over there, painted near Fauntleroy Ferry Dock. But up at Port Townsend, I would go out to the Washington coast, and I would just stretch these watercolor papers and do 2 or 3 quick studies of what was in front of me. So at that point, I believed that I would probably be an artist and find galleries that would represent my work and just struggle as an artist the rest of my life. But I'm still. So I was fairly I was really smart back then because that's exactly what I've done. Struggled the rest of my life. So these are paintings, but when I went to the University of Washington, I started painting more from my imagination, and my work invariably got more and more abstract. And you study the Impressionist period, and I went through my oil period. But watercolor was much better suited to who I am because I don't like to wait and watch oil paint dry. And I remember my parents, many of you might remember on California Avenue, had a little printing shop and wedding photography business. So both parents worked side by side for 40 years. But I would be home, and I would be oil painting at school, but bringing the paintings home. And I remember turning the oven up to high and trying to bake the oil paint to dry faster. So they would come home, and the house would smell of linseed oil. And they said, "What the hell are you doing, kid?" So yeah, oil wasn't quite the paint. And on weekends, I would be up on the mountains and leading climbs up Mount Rainier and Mount Baker and all the volcanoes of the Northwest. I learned how to read weather, lenticular clouds, so all of this is part of my history, looking down from around 12,000 feet at Cadaver Gap and Mount Adams beyond. So progressing from the wooded ravines behind Fauntleroy Church into the Cascades, up the slope, and on up onto the height of these mountains. I am so fortunate, as are all of you, to live here. I was just in Antarctica earlier this year. After the New Year's, I was in Africa. I love going to Africa and these wild places, but I am such a homing pigeon coming back to the Northwest. So my father gave me an old speed graphic camera from his World War II days, and I started photographing mountains from the summits. And that is, in fact, when my allegiances shifted from painting to photography, because it became much easier to create original photographic compositions than sitting at a blank canvas and trying to conjure up a painting or a composition. My friendships in the Boeing Company eventually led to an invitation to join them on the first Western expedition allowed by the Chinese government into Tibet and up the northeast ridge of Mount Everest. Because back in the 80s, early 80s, we were starting to sell jets to the Chinese government. So they parlayed that into an invitation. And when I was in high school, I studied geography on my own and history. And so I always had my head buried in atlases and studying. In fact, I would argue I know way more about the world and the various countries than any living president ever has, because that's what I love to do. And so I knew that the chance to go to Tibet was huge, not because I ever had delusions of standing on the world's highest peak. I wanted to see what Lhasa was, because we knew nothing about Tibet since the Red Guard and Mao's troops went in and closed off all information. So I wanted to go see Lhasa. So we went to Tibet. Our base camp was at 16,000 feet, and we attempted the Northeast Ridge. And eventually we got to within 800 feet of the summit. But there's that little blip on that ridge. It's called the first and second step. They're very technical routes, and back then there was no living human being that had ever climbed this route. There was no Google Earth. There was no reliable maps. We were climbing blind. Today, that route has fixed ladders en route. George Mallory, who disappeared with Andrew Irvin in the early 1900s attempting this route, were later found after our expedition right in and around here that confirmed where they did. It was a great climbing mystery for the longest time. So I was learning how to photograph at elevation. And when I first got into camp, I was sick. I was sick for about 2 weeks. And Judy Piggott, where are you? Your cousin, Ann Wyckoff, is she your cousin? Yeah, your aunt. And her husband, Evans Wyckoff, joined us for the first 2 weeks, as did Mel Stamper, who was the president of Boeing at the time. And I had Mel Stamper bringing chicken soup to me because I was suffering from cerebral edema at 16,000 feet, which is the swelling of the brain in the brain case. And we had 3 neurosurgeons on our expedition, and they were so delighted that I fell ill because they had all this gadgets, and they were trying to do high altitude research on cerebral edema. I eventually got better. They could not evacuate me because we would have had to go up out of base camp, up to 17,000 feet. So I stayed in camp, and I eventually got better. I was really sick and cold and miserable. It was the winter of 1984, and it was blowing snow, and I'm laying in the tent thinking, I can't wait till this expedition is over. And then I heard these bells. And at first they were so faint that I thought I was imagining it. And eventually they became louder and louder, and I stuck my head out of the tent. And I saw in the distance these yaks in a blizzard. And I grabbed my camera, and I'm laying in the entrance to the tent, and I'm photographing this. And even at that moment when I took this picture, I knew my life had changed. I knew that in that picture there was nothing that overtly said modern times. That if Marco Polo had a camera back in the day, he could have taken a picture identical to this. And I was absolutely certain that if I survived this expedition, that I would want to go often and as far as I could go to record cultures that were traditional that would inevitably change with the years to come. So from the Amazon to the Sahara to the Andes, Himalayas, I would travel, and that's in fact what I've done. I've never stopped traveling from that expedition. I was learning, as I said, to use foregrounds and backgrounds and to withstand the cold and use the f-stops and take long exposures. And all of this was kind of new for me because I hadn't been photographing for all that long. Mount Lingtran rose above and beyond our base camp in this beautiful pyramidal shape. We got all phases of the moon and the sun over that mountain. And our expedition, after 3 months, we literally ran out of time. We were the only expedition on the mountain that winter that did not lose a single life. There was 13 other expeditions, all on the Nepal side, up the West Ridge, and every expedition lost at least 1 or 2 human beings. But we said, no life is worth the summit. So let's climb slow and climb safe, because we're all friends. We lost collectively 378 pounds of weight in 3 months. I lost 45 pounds. 45 pounds. Back then, when you come home, and I think, Robert, you were at the airport, yeah? Nobody recognized me. I was so skinny and tanned. I walked right past my parents who were looking. Back then, you could be at the gate. And I came right past my parents, and I thought, okay, they're just joking. So I walked right past, and they're still looking. And I doubled back and tapped my mother on her shoulder, and she looked at me and started crying. She thought I was dead. And I was never in such great shape. I could, full court basketball in Lhasa at 12,000 feet. I was just wiry and thin, and I knew I could eat anything for at least 3 months before I start putting weight on.